I called my son while I was at the grocery store. Do you want pumpkin pie or apple pie for Thanksgiving? Son, I asked. He stayed silent for a moment, then said, Oh, we already had Thanksgiving dinner yesterday. I thought he was joking. Then his wife grabbed the phone and said everything was easier without you there. I gave the cake to a homeless boy and asked him, Do you want to change your life? 3 hours later, my son called back and started screaming. The jar of corn pudding mix was the last thing on my list. I remember standing in the baking aisle of Kroger on Peachtree Road, gripping a small notepad my late wife, Patricia, had given me the Christmas before she passed. She'd filled that same notepad with her grocery lists for 11 years. The handwriting on the older pages was hers, loopy, unhurried, full of personality. The handwriting on my page that morning was mine, blocky, careful, the penmanship of a man who spent 40 years gripping electrical wire instead of a pen. Corn pudding mix, biscuits, pecan praline topping for the pie. Welcome back to Wise Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If these stories have ever made you feel less alone, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and leave a like before you go. It means more than you know. While you settle in, tell me in the comments what you're up to right now. Cooking dinner, sitting in traffic, winding down for the night. I'd love to know who's listening. One quick note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to real individuals is entirely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. 3 hours that morning had gone toward finishing the paperwork I planned to carry to Thanksgiving dinner. Not the corn pudding mix, not the biscuits. Those were almost beside the point. The real thing was the envelope on my kitchen table back on Sycamore Street. 2 pages folded once, written in plain terms, an account of what I had done with my savings across the previous 4 years. $480,000. I want to be straight about what that figure represented for someone like me. I was not a surgeon, not a hedge fund manager, not a tech executive, none of the professions my son Derek liked to suggest he brushed shoulders with at dinner parties. For 39 years, I was a licensed electrician at a mid-sized Decatur contractor on site, before the sun most mornings, finishing each day with scorched fingertips and a paycheck that was solid without ever being remarkable. Every dollar in that envelope was a vacation never taken, an appliance left unreplaced, a bonus routed quietly into savings, while I kept driving a truck with 190,000 miles on it, because it ran, and that was reason enough. 6 weeks before that morning, I had closed on a house on Claremont Court. Single story, 3 bedrooms, a covered back porch that gathered the afternoon light, precisely the way Patricia had always said a porch ought to. I had gone through it twice with Derek and his wife Amber back in September. Amber had declared the kitchen backsplash outdated. Derek had measured the garage with his phone and concluded both cars would fit. Not one question from either of them about how I had managed to pay for it outright. I hadn't resented that. Watching them walk those rooms had been sufficient. I set the jar of corn pudding mix in the cart and glanced at the time. 11:47. Dinner was at 2:00. Enough margin to finish up here, drive home, swap my shirt, and cover the 18 minutes to Derek and Amber's place on Avondale Terrace. I fished out my phone to call ahead, a habit Patricia had always kept before turning up anywhere. She held that calling first was the dividing line between a guest and someone who simply appeared. I dialed Derek at 11:47 with the phone pressed between my ear and shoulder and a dessert in each hand. Hey, son. Pumpkin pie or apple pie, which should I bring today? The pause before he answered stretched long enough that I pulled the phone away and checked to see if the call was still live. Then he spoke. A beat of silence first. Somewhere behind him, I caught Amber's voice, low, clipped, the register she used when she wasn't looking to be heard clearly. Dad. Derek's tone changed then. Not warmer, quieter, leveled out. We did dinner last night. My brain took a moment to do anything useful with that. I nearly laughed, assuming it was a joke that maybe Amber's side of the family had come through early. They'd eaten informally, and the real gathering was still ahead. What do you mean? I asked. Everybody was here. He delivered it without inflection, the way someone reads a departure time off a departures board. Unattached. Amber's people were able to make it Wednesday, so that's when we did it. My chest cinched the way it does when you close your hand around a live wire before confirming the breaker is off. That whole-body jolt, the knowledge that something is wrong, arriving a half-second before the mind can name it. You moved Thanksgiving. That's what I said. It's not a big deal, Dad. It's just a date, Derek. I held my voice flat. You didn't think to call me silence again. Then Amber behind him, sharper now, her words still not quite reaching me. When Derek came back on something in his manner had hardened. Whatever flatness had been there before had sharpened into something chosen, purposeful. I heard movement, and then it wasn't Derek's voice anymore. Amber had taken the phone. Not by accident. This was something she'd positioned herself to say. Honestly, Harold, everything just ran smoother without you there. Stated the way you state a measurement you've already confirmed is accurate. Derek didn't retrieve the phone. He didn't push back. What the quiet after that communicated his voice hadn't needed to. He wasn't loud. He didn't carry the edge of someone deliberately trying to wound. He had the manner of a man who had worked through something methodically and reached a result he considered sound. That was the part that made my grip on the cart handle go uncertain. All right. I said it. I don't know what possessed me to say it. Nothing had been agreed to. Nothing had been excused. My mouth needed to close the call before something cracked in my voice, and I became a man weeping in a grocery store on Thanksgiving morning. I ended the call. The biscuits were still in my hand. I returned them to the shelf with the deliberateness of someone whose hands are functioning while the rest of him is somewhere far away. The cart held corn pudding mix, pecan praline topping, and a box of Patricia's preferred coffee brand that I'd picked up on reflex for 20 years. She had poured 1 cup every Thanksgiving before the house woke up, and my hand still found it without being told to. I left the cart in the aisle and walked out of Kroger into pale November light. The parking lot carried the smell of rain still threatening to fall. My truck sat near the cart return because Patricia had maintained that choosing that spot was how you demonstrated an understanding of how actions connected to consequences. I settled into the driver's seat door, open keys resting in my palm. $480,000. The envelope hadn't moved from my kitchen table. The deed on Claremont Court still bore my name on every line, every page, every notarized block. Nothing had transferred. No ownership had shifted. My plan had been to deliver their future to them that afternoon, alongside a plate of turkey and corn pudding mix I'd chosen myself. I sat looking at the store entrance. That Kroger still held a chocolate cake I'd intended to bring left off my written list, because I'd figured I'd circle back for it after the biscuits as a last-minute addition. I went in and got it. I had no clear plan for it yet. I just knew it wasn't staying behind. I headed north on Commerce Drive, without any conscious decision to do so. That is the truest account I have of the 20 minutes following that parking lot. My hands managed the wheel. My foot found the brake where it needed to. I came to a stop at a red light at College Avenue and watched a family of 4 make their way across. Father with a toddler balanced on his hip. Mother managing a foil-covered casserole dish. 2 older children out ahead in their dress shoes moving fast. Someone was expecting them. A table was set somewhere with their names on it. The light went green, and I didn't move until a car behind me tapped the horn, and then I moved because that's what the green light requires. The chocolate cake rode in its white bakery box on the passenger seat. I had paid 9.15 for it at the register without retaining any clear memory of the transaction. My receipt was folded into my jacket pocket. I confirmed that later, the way you confirm minor details once the major ones have become unmanageable. I reached the turn for Sycamore Street and didn't take it. The ramp toward the freeway came next. I let that pass, too. Patricia used to tell me I drove the way I wired a house, that I always knew where the current had to go even before I'd charted it out deliberately. She said it fondly. She'd be standing in the kitchen doorway, coffee in hand, watching me ease the truck down the driveway at 5:00 in the morning, and she'd wear that specific smile she reserved for things she found practical and quietly amusing in equal measure. I hadn't visited that memory in several months. It found me now unbidden and exact in the cab of a truck, going nowhere purposeful on a Thanksgiving morning. I turned left on Scott Boulevard because the signal was with me, and forward felt easier than sitting still. 2 blocks on a banner caught my eye. Rope hung between a pair of wooden posts outside a squat brick building I had passed without thought 100 times over. Decatur Community Table Thanksgiving Meal All Welcome. Orange and brown lettering, hand-applied, visibly uneven, the work of volunteers on a Wednesday evening, not a sign maker with a plumb line and a practiced stroke. Near the front entrance, a folding table held a big coffee urn and a row of paper cups. 2 women in matching green aprons were setting covered trays out on a cart near the entrance. I idled at the curb with the engine going for longer than made sense. I was not someone who walked into places uninvited. 4 decades as an electrician had left me with a firm understanding of the difference between a space that had called for you and one that hadn't. You knocked first. You stated who you were. You let someone tell you where the fault was before you ever touched a wire. But I was carrying a chocolate cake that had been meant for a table that had deliberately arranged itself without a seat for me. And through the glass door of that brick building, I could see people navigating folding tables with the focused efficiency of people who had organized something hard and were making it hold together. I cut the engine. The woman at the door identified herself as the volunteer coordinator and checked the seal on the bakery box. Standard procedure for donated food, she explained. Health department rules for any shared meal. I told her I understood and signed the donor sheet on her clipboard. That was when I saw the boy. He stood about 8 feet away near a bulletin board, plastered in children's drawings, gripping the sleeve of a woman's coat with one fist. The grip of a child who is uneasy about a room but refuses to let it show. He was around 8 years old. Dark hair grown a little long, falling forward over his forehead. His sneakers were clean, but the left sole had started to peel away at the toe, the precise kind of wear that accumulates when a shoe has been pushed past the end of its useful life. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the bakery box in the volunteer's hands, and his face did something I hadn't anticipated. It didn't go wide and eager the way children's faces tend to go when something sweet turns up. It went measured, watchful. The expression of someone who wants a thing badly enough that they've learned to study it before reaching. The woman next to him caught me watching. She came forward and put out her hand, the practiced grip of someone who had been introducing herself in professional rooms for many years. "Vivian Holt," she said. "And this is my grandson, Eli." She was in her early 70s, I estimated. Neatly put together a wool cardigan over a collared shirt, silver hair drawn back in a style that had probably looked the same for 3 decades. Behind her eyes there was a tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. The particular fatigue of someone who has been managing a hard situation for so long, they have simply grown more skilled at concealing it. Eli looked up from the bakery box just long enough to assess my face with the gravity that 8-year-old boys reserve for adults whose verdict is still out. "Is that cake?" he asked. "Chocolate," I said. from the bakery on Peachtree Road. He looked back at the box. His hand tightened fractionally on his grandmother's sleeve. Is it really for everybody here? The question came out so measured, so softly, that I leaned forward to be certain I'd caught it. He wasn't asking whether he could have a piece. He was asking whether the generosity itself was genuine, whether a cake appearing on Thanksgiving morning in a place like this actually meant what it seemed to mean, or whether some condition was attached that would explain his grandmother's exhaustion and the provisional feeling of everything around them. Vivian placed her hand on top of his head. "Eli," she said, in the patient, practiced tone of a woman who had said his name exactly that way 10,000 times before. "No. It's a fair question," I said. I looked at the boy directly. His left sneaker sole had separated another millimeter as he shifted his weight. "It's for everyone in this room," I said. "That includes you. No strings." Eli's face opened into something so unguarded it landed in my chest like a fist. Not excitement. Relief. Clean, uncomplicated relief. The kind that only surfaces on a face that has held itself braced against disappointment long enough that a simple, ordinary kindness has come to feel like something not to be trusted. I glanced at Vivian, then back at Eli, who had drifted toward the bulletin board and was pressing a paper snowflake flat against the wall with both palms. He passed the box to the volunteer, who carried it off toward the tables. He tracked it across the room, then looked back up at me. "Is there more?" he asked. "Not today," I told him. "But maybe something better." I looked at him straight. "Do you want to change your life, son?" He blinked. 8 years old, standing in a community center in worn-out sneakers, and he answered without a pause. "Yes," he said. "I want Grandma to stop worrying." I straightened up and turned to Vivienne. I said I thought I might know someone worth a conversation. I gave her the name Adaize Nwosu and the word cornerstone, and told her to bring it to her caseworker. I wasn't promising anything beyond the name. I shook Vivian's hand, told her it was good to meet them both, and walked back toward my truck. I passed the folding table with the coffee urn on the way out. I poured a cup I had no real need for and stood drinking it in the thin November sunlight, turning over 9 words my son had said to me an hour earlier. "Everything was just easier without you there." And then 4 words from an 8-year-old boy instead. "Is it really real?" My phone moved in my jacket pocket. I looked at the screen. Derek. I hit the side button and laid the phone face down on the folding table. The coffee was too hot and had the taste of something brewed well before I arrived, which it probably had been. I drank it anyway, standing in the parking lot of a community center on Thanksgiving, because somewhere behind those glass doors, a boy named Eli was about to have chocolate cake, and believe at least for that afternoon that some things come without conditions. I picked up my phone. The call I had to make wasn't to my son. The call was to Gareth Finch. Gareth had been my attorney for 11 years, since the week after Patricia was diagnosed, when I understood I needed someone who knew Georgia property law well enough to ensure that whatever happened next, the things we had built would land where we meant them to. He was 63, a former public defender who had come into estate and real estate work after 3 decades in courtrooms. What I valued most in him was what I valued most in anyone I brought in to do precise work. He said what he meant and stopped there. His office was closed for Thanksgiving. I already knew that when I dialed. I called anyway and kept my voicemail to 4 sentences because Gareth had once told me that any legal instruction running past 4 sentences was a man engineering his own confusion. I said, "My name is Harold Voss. I am instructing you to halt all steps connected to the property transfer of the Claremont Courthouse effective immediately. No deed delivery, no closing documents, no further action of any kind until you hear from me directly." I will follow up in writing within the hour. In Georgia, a property transfer carries no legal weight until a grant deed has been signed, notarized, and recorded with the DeKalb County Recorder's Office. I had signed nothing. Nothing had been notarized. The house on Claremont Court was mine in every legal sense that existed. Every assessment, every tax filing, every title document named me and no one else. What Derek and Amber believed they were inheriting lived entirely within their own expectations. The law had never ratified a word of it. I sat in my truck outside the Decatur community table and typed a follow-up to Gareth's office email copying his paralegal, whose address I had saved from the last time we had revised my will. I repeated the 4 instructions in writing and appended a single line. Please log the time of this correspondence as evidence of my intent. Then I pocketed my phone, started the engine, and drove home. The envelope was still on my kitchen table, exactly where I had set it that morning. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, looking at it. A standard white business envelope, the kind that comes in a box of 50 from any office supply store. I had printed Derek and Amber across the front in my block handwriting. Inside were 2 pages laying out the gift, the purchase price, the address, the transfer timeline I had mapped out, and the reason I had chosen that particular house on that particular street. Near the end of those 2 pages, I had written a paragraph about Patricia, about how she had once described the kind of house she hoped the family would all grow old near. Close enough to visit without it feeling obligatory, far enough that coming was still a choice. I had found Claremont Court because of that paragraph. I drove past it 17 times before putting in an offer because I needed to be sure it was the right street. I took the envelope and tucked it in the kitchen drawer alongside the measuring tape and the takeout menus. Then I put the kettle on because my hands wanted something to occupy them. My phone rang at 2:14 in the afternoon. Derek's name on the screen. I let it ring twice before I picked up. He was already at full volume when the call connected. Not the building shout of someone running low on patience, but the immediate wall-to-wall shout of a man who had been holding something in for 3 hours and had decided there was no longer any reason to. "What did you do?" His voice hit me like something solid. "I just got off the phone with Gareth Finch's office." "What did you do, Dad?" "His paralegal," I said. "Gareth is with his family." "What did you do?" "I instructed him to stop the property transfer," I said. "Nothing on the house has been signed or recorded. As the owner of record, I exercised my right to halt the process. You can't just—" He stopped. I heard him pull air through his nose the way he had since he was a teenager, when a plan had gone sideways. "Dad, we've been building around that house for months. Amber has paint swatches. We've already spoken to a contractor about the kitchen. You spoke to a contractor about a kitchen in a house that was never legally yours," I said. "I never signed a deed. I never filed a transfer. I told you what I intended to do. I had not done it yet. Because we trusted you." His voice caught on the word trusted in a way I recognized. Not grief, not real hurt, but the sound a person makes when they reach for an emotion they believe will move the room. "We made plans based on your word, Dad. That means something." "I'll make my word," I said. "You want to talk about what words mean?" The silence on his end held just long enough for me to understand he hadn't seen that coming. "Derek," I said, "you told me this morning that everything was easier without me there. You said that at 11:47 a.m. while I was standing in a grocery store holding a cake I had bought for your table. You planned Thanksgiving without me and did not call. You moved the date without telling me. And now you want to have a conversation about what my word means to you. That is completely different." "It is not different," I said. "It is the same thing. You determine what counts and what doesn't based on whatever is convenient at the moment you're deciding." His voice shifted again. The manufactured composure peeled back. and what came through underneath was raw, less rehearsed, and for a moment I thought something genuine was going to surface. Then Amber said something clipped in the background, and whatever had opened closed back over. "You are doing this to punish us," Derek said. "I am doing this," I said, "because the house is mine. Because it has always been mine. And because I am 68 years old, and I have earned the right to make my own decisions about what I spent 40 years building without needing your approval. So that's it." His voice was climbing now, losing its shape entirely. "You're just taking it back. Like it's nothing. Like we're nothing." My throat tightened, not with guilt, with something older and harder to put a name to. The specific grief of a parent who understands that the child he is speaking to and the child he raised are not the same person anymore, and who cannot locate the exact point at which that distance became permanent. "You told me I wasn't wanted at your table," I said. "I'm asking the same question back. What exactly is it that you want from me, Derek?" He didn't answer. Not because he had nothing to say. His breathing was audible and uneven, the sound of a man sorting through his options, but none of the options in front of him were honest ones. And even Derek at his worst seemed to understand that an honest answer to that question would end something that couldn't be unended. "We'll come over," he said at last. "Tonight. We'll talk in person." "No," I said. I hadn't planned to say it. The word came fully formed without deliberation, the way the correct wire gauge comes to mind before you've consciously run the numbers on the load. "Not tonight," I said. "I'll be in touch when I'm ready." I ended the call. I stood in my kitchen with the kettle starting to whistle, and the drawer shut over the envelope I had written for people who had already celebrated what was inside it, without the man who put it together. Cliff Branagh appeared at my door at 4:30 with a foil-covered plate and the look of a man who already knew more than he planned to lead with. That was Cliff's way. He had lived 3 houses down on Sycamore Street for 22 years, and in those 22 years I had come to understand that he never showed up at your door without a reason, and never stated that reason before he had eaten something. His wife Dottie had passed 2 years before Patricia, and since then the two of us had developed the specific friendship of widowed men in their late 60s, mostly practical, occasionally honest, sentimental, only when one of us had been drinking, which on a Thanksgiving afternoon was not outside the realm of possibility. "Dottie used to make this the night before," he said, holding out the plate. "Green bean casserole. I put it together this morning. It's not as good as hers, but it's hot." I stepped back and let him in. We sat at the kitchen table because that is where people eat in a house like mine. Cliff took the chair that had been Patricia's for 30 years, without knowing it, which was fine. I had stopped attaching grief to furniture somewhere in the 2nd year. He didn't ask how Thanksgiving had gone. He helped himself to a portion of casserole with the large spoon he had brought along, because he had long since learned I never had the right serving utensil for anything, and he ate with the focused attention of a man who respected food enough not to talk through it. I was grateful for that. I had spent enough of the day with words that had done damage. Silence that was chosen rather than imposed felt something close to mercy. It was Cliff who broke it eventually. He set his fork down and slid the plate forward 2 inches, the signal that he was done eating and ready to speak. Then he looked across the table at me with the directness that had always been the most useful quality he possessed. "Derek called me," he said. My hand stopped on its way to the water glass. "Same this morning," Cliff continued. "Before noon. He wanted to know whether I'd seen you leave the house, whether you seemed upset." He paused. He used the word unstable. The word dropped into the kitchen like something thrown from a height. "Unstable," I repeated. "That was his word," Cliff said. His jaw set slightly. He had a broad face deeply lined from 40 years of working outdoors, and when something offended him, his expression didn't perform it. It simply went still in a way that was more unsettling than any visible anger. I told him I hadn't seen you, he said, and asked why he was calling a neighbor rather than his own father. He said you weren't picking up, and he was worried. I thought about the 2:14 p.m. call I had answered, and the one before it I'd let go in the parking lot of the community center. Derek had called Cliff Branagh. Between those two calls had telephoned my neighbor to ask whether I seemed mentally compromised, and framed it as concern. He's been doing that for a while, Cliff said. I'm calling around, asking questions about you. I should have said something sooner. I'm telling you now because I think you need the full picture of what you're up against. I looked at the green bean casserole going cold in its foil pan, and thought about the word unstable and what a person might do with a word like that given enough time and the right attorney. What kind of questions? I said. Cliff folded his hands on the table. About your memory, whether you repeated yourself, whether you got confused about dates or money, whether you'd said anything about changing your will. He held my eyes. He asked me once whether I thought you were capable of making sound financial decisions on your own. Silence had settled over the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed itself awake. Somewhere on the street outside, somebody was already firing off fireworks out of place for Thanksgiving, but not out of character for Decatur, where certain neighbors treated any holiday as a license for the same routine. He asked you that, I said. 8 months back, Cliff said. I told him you were the clearest-headed man on this street, and if he had concerns about your money, he might consider spending some of his own for once. No edge in it. Just the flat delivery of something he had been sitting on for a while. Harold, I've had eyes on that boy for 20 years. I watched you clear his car loan in 2018 and turn around and tell Patricia it was a gift. I watched you fund his deposit on the Avondale Terrace place and stand at the block party calling it a helping hand. I watched him plant himself in your driveway last Easter and announce that your truck embarrassed him to park near. Something tightened in my chest. Not shock, every individual fact Cliff had just named was already somewhere in my memory. What was new was hearing them strung together by another man laid out one behind the other without a break, the way a wiring diagram shows you the whole circuit at once instead of wire by wire, and you finally see where the fault has been hiding all along. He told Amber's family the Claremont courthouse was an investment move, Cliff said. Claimed you were titling it in his name for tax reasons. That was the story he gave them at their Easter table. Cliff's gaze held steady on mine. Word reached me through Bet Lacefield, 2 houses down. Amber's mother rang her. They share the same garden club. Amber's people believe this whole arrangement was a financial play. Not generosity, a structure that works in your favor. I moved my chair back from the table, the slow, careful way of a man who isn't certain his legs will take his weight. I had spent years cutting spending and letting vacations slide, grinding through 3 Decatur summers in a truck whose air conditioning had quit, all toward the goal of handing my son something he could not lose. I had carried a picture in my mind of his expression when the envelope reached his hands. Of him saying his mother's name the way he did as a child, that sound that was part shout, part announcement, part pure gratitude, a sound Patricia had cherished above almost anything else he ever produced. He described it as a tax move, I said. That's what Bet Lacefield told you. I got up and crossed to the kitchen window. The yard outside had not changed. The fig tree Patricia had planted in 2002 that had never produced a single ripe fig, she had laughed harder at that tree each passing year. The electrical conduit I'd run along the back fence myself, still the same conduit I'd been meaning to replace for 6 years. Ordinary, undisturbed. Cliff, I said, still facing the glass. In 20 years, did he say one thing to you about me that was generous? Cliff didn't rush his answer. The pause was how I knew he was giving it full weight. One time he said, "You were the finest electrician he'd ever watched work." The boy was 17. You just solved something at his school that had beaten 3 other contractors, and his friends took notice. A beat of quiet. After that, I can't recall a single generous word about you. I turned back to face him. Cliff had the look of a man who had concluded long ago that plain speaking at their stage of life was the only honest thing left to offer. "There's something more," he said. "About Leonard." Hearing my brother's name come from Cliff's mouth brought me to a full stop. "What about Leonard?" I said. Cliff glanced at his hands on the table, then back up at me. "Derek told you Leonard cut off contact because he resented what you'd made of yourself," Cliff said. "That was the story, wasn't it?" My throat tightened. "That's what Derek told me," I said. 4 years ago. Cliff gave a slow nod, the nod of a man confirming what he had been hoping he was wrong about. "Leonard came to me 6 months after you and he stopped speaking," Cliff said. "He was trying to find your address because your number had changed. He said Derek had reached out and told him you were done, that you'd called Leonard toxic, and said you needed to cut the tie." Cliff kept his voice level and precise. "Leonard accepted it, Harold. He took his nephew's word over his own brother's, because who expects a son to fabricate something like that?" The fireworks popped again outside a string of 3 nearer this time. I lowered myself back into my chair because remaining upright had stopped being intentional. Cliff headed out at 5:15, foil pan in hand, and left the house carrying the one thing I didn't want: a silence with real mass to it. I sat at that table for 11 minutes. I can tell you exactly how long because the clock over the stove has a second hand that Patricia had specifically requested on the grounds that a kitchen clock without one wasn't serious about cooking. I tracked that hand through 11 full circuits before I unlocked my phone and pulled up a contact I hadn't called in 4 years. Leonard Gerard Savannah. Still there, never removed. Over the months that followed our falling out, I had told myself I kept it for the same reason you don't discard a tool you've set aside. It occupies no space, and the future has a way of creating needs you didn't anticipate. The truer explanation was less practical. Removing it would have been an admission that the separation had no end, and there was a part of me that had refused to make that admission. He answered on the second ring. "Harold." His voice was unchanged, lower than mine, unhurried, carrying the particular ease of someone who had spent 30 years in Savannah and let the city's tempo find its way into him. For a moment, words didn't come, because his voice was so precisely itself, and 4 years had passed since I last heard it, and only now did I understand how much of my own story was stored inside the sound of my brother's voice. "It's Harold," I said. "Cliff Branagh told me something tonight, and I need to put a question to you directly." A pause. "Cliff Branagh." Longer pause. "All right. Go ahead. Did Derek contact you 4 years ago and tell you I'd said I wanted no more contact?" What followed was not the silence of a man choosing whether to respond. It was the silence of a man suddenly perceiving the outline of something he had been enclosed by, without ever seeing its walls. "He told me you called me toxic," Leonard said. The care in his voice was the kind that comes from holding something fragile. That you needed space, that Patricia's death had led you to reconsider certain people in your life, and that I was one you'd decided was doing you harm. He went quiet. "He made the call from your number, Harold. Your own cell. I had no cause to doubt it." The phone case gave slightly under my grip. Derek had called my brother using my phone, waiting until the house was empty. I couldn't pinpoint the exact occasion, but in those early months after Patricia died, Derek had been a constant presence sorting paperwork, keeping me company after dark running to the pharmacy. I had handed him the door code. I had offered him the open-ended trust that a grieving house extends to a son. He had turned my phone into a weapon spoken in my voice and severed the one bond in my family that predated his own existence. "I need to sit down," Leonard said. "I'm already sitting, but give me a moment." "Take it," I said. His breathing was audible across the line. Behind him faintly a woman's voice asking something, and Leonard saying just above a whisper, "Colette. Give me a minute, Colette." Then he returned. "I wrote you 3 letters," he said. "By hand on paper, I thought perhaps you'd blocked the number. I posted them to Sycamore Street." "I never got them," I said. "No," Leonard said. "I don't imagine you did." Neither of us spoke for a moment. We just sat with it. During those months, Derek had been in and out of the house constantly. The mailbox sat at the foot of the driveway, and I almost never checked it. That had been Patricia's task, and the habit had not transferred to me. 3 handwritten letters from my brother in Savannah, arriving precisely when I was least equipped to notice anything going missing. Taken or destroyed by the son I'd given a key to my home. "There's one more thing," Leonard said. "Something I couldn't make sense of at the time. I think I can now." He cleared his throat. "Around 8 months back, Derek rang me out of nowhere. Warmer this time, sociable, just touching base. He brought up your name. Wanted to know how I figured you were getting on. Had I picked up on anything different about you?" Then a pause. He dropped the phrase cognitive decline into the conversation. Asked me straight whether I thought you still had the mental clarity to be running your own financial affairs. The whole thing had the feel of a man who'd already written his conclusion and was only fishing for people to sign off on it. The refrigerator hummed in the background. Out front, the last of the fireworks had gone quiet. In Georgia, a conservatorship is a court-ordered arrangement under which a judge designates someone a conservator to take charge of another person's finances or daily care when that person is determined to be incapable of managing those things themselves. It exists as a safeguard for adults who are genuinely vulnerable. To put one in place requires a formal petition, a hearing before a judge, and documented medical proof of incapacity. But that same structure in the hands of someone acting in bad faith can be turned into a tool, a way for a family member to reach for legal dominion over another person's money and property, so long as they first lay down enough of a paper trail to make the target look mentally unfit. Cliff had already told me Derek had been quietly working the neighbors for stories about my memory lapses and my spending habits. Now Leonard was sitting across from me telling me Derek had raised the same cognitive decline question with him. And 3 months before that, Derek had volunteered to cover the cost of a thorough medical evaluation for me, and had genuinely seemed thrown when I said no, that I already had a doctor, I trusted insurance that worked fine, and no need of anyone booking appointments on my behalf. I had read all of it as fatherly attention. Told Cliff it was nothing more than concern, felt something close to warmth at the idea that my son was keeping an eye on my health. "He was building a file," I said. "That's what this sounds like." Leonard said it plainly. I moved back to the kitchen window. The fig tree Patricia had planted in 2002 stood in the dark of the backyard. Nothing but a silhouette against the fence, barely distinguishable from shadow. Patricia had put it in the ground the spring Derek turned 9. She used to say that every yard needed at least one thing rooted in pure hope, not something you planted because the yield was guaranteed, but because you were willing to trust the general direction of growth. That tree had never given us a single ripe fig. We kept it all the same. "Leonard," I said. "I should have called a long time ago. I'm sorry I took what he said at face value without Harold." He didn't raise his voice to correct me, just spoke quietly over mine. You were in grief. The worst stretch of your life, and your own son handed you a version of events that you had every reason to believe. There was no betrayal you could have seen coming. That isn't weakness. That's what it means to be a person. Something behind my eyes went hot. I pressed my wrist firmly against them, the way you isolate a live wire before you can safely get your hands on the work. There's something you need to hear about the house, I said. Cliff gave me the outline, Leonard said. I want to hear it from you. I went through the whole thing. The 4 years of saving, the purchase, the envelope sitting on the kitchen table, the call from inside the grocery store, the 9 words. I laid out what Gareth Finch had done, the transfer that never cleared, the call that came in at 2:14, and the way Derek's voice shed its careful, measured surface the moment he realized the answer wasn't what he'd planned for. Leonard didn't cut in once. That had always been the quality in my brother. I'd been worst at appreciating his gift for carrying the full weight of a long story without dropping any of it into silence just to make room for himself. When I'd said everything there was to say, he asked one question. What do you need from me tonight? My throat seized for the second time, different from the first. The first time it had been grief with a blade in it. What I felt now ran deeper than that. It was the specific ache of having someone ask you without agenda, without strings, what you actually needed, someone who'd been keeping count of your days since before you had any way to keep count of your own. I just need to know you haven't gone anywhere, I said. I'm right here, Leonard said. Always have been. I only wish I'd known sooner that you were still looking. Down on Sycamore Street, a car drifted past with all 4 windows open, a Thanksgiving football game bleeding out of its radio and dissolving into the November air. Everything outside moving at its ordinary pace, indifferent to what was being said inside my kitchen. Come up this weekend, I said. I've got things to show you. Saturday morning, he said. Count on it. I'll have Colette with me. I said goodnight to my brother for the first time in 4 years. After the line dropped, I stood at the kitchen counter with the phone pressed flat against my chest, the way a man holds something he believed he had lost permanently and had returned to him without warning. Sleep didn't come on Thanksgiving night. That's not as remarkable a thing as it sounds. Since Patricia passed, my relationship with sleep had grown complicated in a way her doctor called adjustment insomnia, and that I would have described differently as lying awake in the dark, cataloging every sentence I never got around to saying to someone who was no longer there to hear any of it. 10 o'clock was when I usually went under. 2 in the morning was when I came back up. The stretch from 200 to 500. I had learned to treat the way I once treated the pre-dawn hours on a work site before the crew pulled in, before the noise started, when you could get through a solid hour of thinking without anyone asking you anything. That night, the thinking had a different subject. I settled into the armchair in the living room, my phone on the side table. The floor lamp dialed all the way down to its lowest warmth, the setting Patricia had always called the reading light, though neither of us had actually read beneath it in 20 years. I hadn't planned to open Derek's Instagram. It just happened. Social media wasn't something I spent time on. I'd made an account 3 years back because Patricia's sister had put up photos from a family reunion I hadn't attended, and I'd wanted to see the pictures. After that, the account sat untouched. Derek's feed came up sluggishly on my screen. 41 posts. The newest dated from 2 days ago. Wednesday evening, the night before Thanksgiving, the same hours when the dinner I hadn't been invited to was taking place. 9 photographs. I pinched the first one open the way Eli did at his age whenever something needed to be examined up close. It showed the dining room of the Avondale Terrace house, the table stretched out with the extra leaf Derek had picked up the spring, before laid with Amber's good china tapered candles, lit at both ends, the sort of composed scene that demands an hour of arranging, and is designed to pass for something effortless. 11 people seated around it. Amber's parents, her sister and brother-in-law, 3 couples I placed as friends of Derek's from the neighborhood, and one older woman I couldn't identify, caught mid-laugh at something happening off-frame. I went through every face in that photo twice. My name was not among the faces. The caption read, "Grateful for the people who fill our table and our lives. So much to look forward to in the year ahead." The image after that was a tight shot of Amber's centerpiece, dried wheat stalks, and small orange gourds nested inside a wooden bowl. I knew the moment I saw it, because I had turned that bowl on a lathe in 1986 in a woodworking class. Patricia had signed the 2 of us up for when Derek was 2 years old. She had believed every home ought to contain at least one thing made by hand. When Derek moved into the Avondale Terrace house, I'd passed the bowl along to him. He'd always admired it. And I was a man with more possessions than he needed, passing things to a son who was only just setting up a life. That bowl made by my hands sat at the center of a Thanksgiving table I had not been invited to share. It appeared in the background of 5 of the 9 photographs. Then I reached the 7th. It stopped my breath for a full 3 seconds. Derek and Amber standing together in the living room, both facing the camera, both smiling, and on the coffee table just behind them, clearly visible, the Claremont Court listing brochure the real estate agent had pressed into our hands on the afternoon of our very first walkthrough. Address on the front. Listing price in large print. That brochure hadn't ended up there by accident. Somebody had placed it in the frame with a purpose. Derek's gaze was on the camera. He wasn't looking at it. He didn't have to look at it. It was positioned for whoever would be looking at the photograph later. I turned my phone face down on the side table, palms flat on my thighs, eyes on the dark rectangle of the window across the room. The following morning, I drove over to the Avondale Terrace house. In Derek's garage, I had 2 boxes of my own equipment, a circuit tester, and a set of channel lock pliers I'd lent him 18 months ago when he was putting in ceiling fans, and had called me because he didn't own a single piece of electrical equipment, in spite of having watched me work with it his entire childhood. I'd said I'd collect them when I got around to it. A year and a half had gone by. I pressed the doorbell. Amber answered. She was already dressed, which caught me off guard. It was 9:15 on the Friday after Thanksgiving, and I had half expected to find neither of them awake yet. She wore the particular expression she kept ready for rapid recalibration, the one that came just before she managed to be gracious about something she hadn't seen coming. Harold. She said my name with the bright surprise of a person who was expecting a phone call and got a knock on the door instead. "We weren't expecting you." "I came for my tools," I said. "The channel lock pliers and the circuit tester. They're out in the garage." She swung the door open, and I stepped into the entry hall. The house carried the smell of fresh coffee, and that warm vanilla scent Amber ran through the rooms on weekends. The living room was in my sightline from where I stood, and the coffee table was clear. The listing brochure was gone, which told me everything I needed to know. Props get put away once the performance is over. Amber walked me through to the garage. My toolbox sat on the shelf right where I'd left it, the same place I always stored equipment at a job I meant to come back to. I lifted it down and ran through the contents. Circuit tester present. Channel lock pliers present. A small roll of electrical tape I'd forgotten was even in there. I was turning to go when the hallway caught my eye. The wall running between the garage door and the kitchen had carried 3 framed photographs ever since Derek and Amber moved in. I had registered them on past visits without ever stopping to actually look. This time, for reasons I couldn't have put cleanly into words, I stopped and looked. The first frame, a wedding photo, Derek and Amber at the altar, both of them lit up with the particular joy of two people who believe the hardest stretch is now behind them. The second, a shot from Amber's parents' anniversary dinner, the whole Kinnaird family arranged across a restaurant patio. The third frame, the one nearest the kitchen door, the one I knew best, because I had a copy of the same photo on my own bookshelf, had always held Derek's college graduation picture. Him in his cap and gown, me standing beside him with my arm across his shoulder. My face doing something it rarely did in photographs. That frame now held something else. Amber's family, at what looked like a lake house summer light, everyone squinting pleasantly into the sun. My graduation photograph with my son had been taken down from his wall and replaced with a picture of people I had met maybe twice in my life. I stood in that hallway with the toolbox in my hand and understood something that no phone call, no conversation, no Instagram post had managed to make this plain. A small rectangle of wall where my face used to be said it more clearly than any of it. Derek had not left me out of Thanksgiving because of a scheduling conflict or a rough patch or some passing irritation with something I had done. He had been steadily, quietly peeling me out of the fabric of his life piece by piece over enough time that a blank space on a wall could pass for an upgrade. Amber appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Did you find everything?" she asked. I looked at the wall. I looked at her. Her eyes tracked to where mine were, to the empty space where the graduation photo had lived, and something shifted across her face. Not quite guilt. More the look of a person caught mid-act who had already talked themselves into believing the act was warranted. "It needed updating," she said. "Of course," I said. I took the toolbox out through the garage and set it in the bed of my truck, and sat behind the wheel in the Avondale Terrace driveway for a long moment. Looking at the front of the house, I had helped Derek buy through the window of a truck he had once called an embarrassment, both hands wrapped around the steering wheel, because the alternative was putting them over my face, and I was not going to do that in his driveway. I turned the key and drove home. The text message came in at 2:17 in the afternoon while I was flat on my back under the kitchen sink, replacing a compression fitting that had been seeping water for 3 weeks. I'd started that repair at noon because I needed a task that demanded both hands and had a defined answer at the end of it. Plumbing wasn't my trade, but 40 years had taught me enough to know that a compression fitting was a compression fitting, and that the satisfaction of sealing a leak belonged to anyone willing to stretch out on a cold floor with a wrench. The leak stopped at 1:54. I stayed under the sink for another 20 minutes. Regardless, the floor was cool, the cabinet smelled of pipe compound and old timber, and it was easier to hold a thought in a tight enclosed space than out in the open where a room pulls your attention in too many directions at once. I was at the Thanksgiving dinner Wednesday night. I've been turning over whether to reach out since then, and I decided I had to. "I'm sorry to contact you like this. Would you be willing to talk?" I read the message twice, lying on the kitchen floor with a wrench in my grip and a wet stain spreading across the knee of my work pants. I sat up, typed back a single word yes, and sent her my number. She called 4 minutes later. Her voice was younger than the careful formality of the text had suggested, and there was a tightness running through it that I recognized immediately, the particular discomfort of someone doing what they believe is right without any guarantee they'll be thanked for it. "Mr. Voss," she said, "thank you for answering." "Harold," I said, "what did you want to tell me?" A short pause. I heard her exhale. "I've worked alongside Derek for 2 years. He talked about you, about the house, about what you were planning to hand over to him. He talked about it the way people talk about something that's already sitting in their name." Another pause. "3 weeks ago, he announced to the whole sales floor that the transfer was basically wrapped up, that he was already mapping out renovations. He said..." She stopped. I'm going to give you his exact words because I think you've earned the exact words. Go ahead, I said. He said, and this is a direct quote, "The old man's finally doing something useful with his savings." That's what he said to 12 people in an open office. Her voice went tight. I have a father, Mr. Voss. He's 66. He spent his whole working life in construction. When Derek said that, I laughed along because everyone else was laughing, and I am not proud of that. But I have been sitting with it since Wednesday night, and I can't just leave it there. I was on my feet at the kitchen counter, still holding the wrench. I set it down on the dish towel with the faded sunflowers on it that Patricia had kept folded over the oven handle, the one I had never swapped out, because it still did its job, and because getting rid of it felt like a decision nobody had asked me to make. What happened Wednesday night? I said. At the dinner. She drew a breath. Derek made a toast partway through the meal after the first round of drinks had gone around. He got to his feet and spoke about the year, his work, Amber, everything moving in the right direction. A pause. He talked about the house, about Claremont Court. He described it as something he and Amber had worked for together, a goal the two of them had reached. He lifted his glass and said, "Next year we'll be hosting this in our new place." Her voice stayed quiet and level. He used the word "our." He said we worked toward it. There were 12 people in that room, Mr. Voss. Not one of them heard your name. The kitchen went very still around me. I thought about 4 years of 7 a.m. starts and holidays I didn't take, and a truck with 190,000 miles on it, and a savings account I had checked every January and told myself was almost enough, almost enough, almost enough. I thought about the envelope on the kitchen table that I had addressed in my own block handwriting. I thought about the paragraph about Patricia, what she had said about wanting a house close enough to visit, but far enough to be a choice. See how he said we worked toward it, I said. Yes, Joelle said. Did anybody ask about me? Another pause, a longer one. Amber's mother asked where you were. Derek told her you had other plans, that you preferred a quieter Thanksgiving. A beat. Amber's mother said that was a shame. Derek said you were used to it. My hand found the counter's edge and held it. You were used to it. Not that I was doing well. Not that this was something I had chosen for myself. That I was used to being without. Used to absence. Used to a table that had no seat for me. Said to a room full of people as though it were simply a known fact about me, like a dietary preference or an old habit. Harold doesn't mind. Harold's used to it. Harold will be fine because Harold is always fine. What I was about to learn in the hours ahead would show me exactly how far someone I loved had been willing to go, and how long it had already been happening. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that a person close to you had been quietly working to undermine you, would you confront them the moment you found out, or would you say nothing and wait until you had the full picture? And that is simply what Harold is for. Mr. Voss, Joelle said carefully. Are you still there? Yes, I said. I'm here. I want you to know, she said, that when everyone lifted their glasses after the toast, I set mine back down on the table. I don't know whether anyone noticed. I couldn't do it. Her voice caught slightly. I've been at that company 2 years, and I've heard Derek talk about you maybe 30 times. Not once in any of it did I hear anything that sounded like gratitude. I thought you deserved to hear that from someone who was actually in the room. I thanked her. I meant every word of it. Picking up the phone to tell a parent that their child is not who they believe them to be takes a particular kind of courage, the kind most people only locate after the moment has gone and spend years wishing they'd used. After the call ended, I stayed at the kitchen counter for a long time. The compression fitting under the sink had stopped weeping. I had fixed that problem at 154, and the fix would hold as long as the fitting had been seated correctly, which it had, because I did not do that kind of work incorrectly. That was the whole of the discipline I had practiced for 40 years. You did it right, or it came apart. And letting it come apart was never a choice you made going in, because when things failed, the cost was always borne by someone else before it was borne by you. 4 decades of making sure the work would hold. I picked up my phone and pulled up the Instagram post again. The one with 11 people at the table and the wooden bowl I had turned by hand in 1986. The listing brochure placed like a stage prop. The caption reading so much to look forward to in the year ahead. I checked the timestamp. Wednesday, 8:47 p.m. At 8:47 p.m. on Wednesday, I had been standing in this kitchen eating leftover soup from a can and watching the evening news and quietly thinking about which tie to put on for Thanksgiving dinner the next day, because Patricia had always said you did not sit down at someone's table without making an effort, and I had not stopped listening to her. At 8:47 p.m., my son had been on his feet in his dining room raising a glass toward a house he did not own, narrating to 12 people work he had not done, accepting congratulations for a future that existed entirely because of a man he had described to his colleagues as finally doing something useful. I closed the app. I scrolled to Gareth Finch's number in my contacts. It was Friday afternoon. His office would still be open. I had further instructions for him that went beyond halting the transfer. What came next called for a different kind of conversation, not about stopping something, but about redirecting the same materials toward an entirely different end. I made the call. Gareth answered on the first ring. "Harold," he said, "I had a feeling I'd be hearing from you. I have some questions," I said, "about what it would take to place a property into a long-term use agreement with a non-profit housing organization." A brief pause. "Then that's not the conversation I was expecting. I like it considerably better." I heard him pull out a chair. "Tell me what you're thinking." Leonard arrived at 9:40 Saturday morning in a gray Volvo with Savannah plates that I didn't recognize, meaning he had bought a new car somewhere in the 4 years we hadn't spoken. That small fact landed harder than I expected, the quiet accumulation of ordinary life events I had not been present for. Because my son had decided my brother and I were more useful to him with distance between us than without it. Leonard was thinner than I remembered. His hair had gone fully white, which mine had not yet done, and he moved with the measured care of a man whose left knee had been repaired twice and who had learned to handle stairs without advertising the effort. Colette was beside him, 68 years old, a retired school librarian with silver reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the particular warmth of a woman who had spent 30 years making children feel welcome inside a room full of books. She hugged me at the door before Leonard did, which was entirely right and entirely like her. We settled in the kitchen because that was where everything that mattered happened in my house. I had made coffee and picked up a box of pastries from Amelie's en Ponce, because Leonard had always needed something to eat in order to get through a hard conversation, and I was not going to ask my brother to sit through the worst thing I had told in years on an empty stomach. Colette poured for all 3 of us without waiting to be asked, which was also exactly right. I walked Leonard through everything I hadn't covered on the phone: the Instagram photographs, the listing brochure arranged in frame like a prop, the wooden bowl I had made in 1986 sitting as Amber's centerpiece at a dinner that had deliberately left out the man who built it, the graduation photograph taken down from the hallway wall, Amber's 2-word explanation it needed updating offered with the expression of a woman who had settled the matter with herself beforehand and was faintly surprised to find it questioned. Leonard listened with both hands around his coffee mug, and his face did what it had always done when he was holding something difficult. It went absolutely still the way a level reads when a surface is perfectly flat, every small tremor quieted in the service of accurate measurement. When I'd said everything, he said, "The bowl." "Yes," I said. "The bowl Mom watched you make." His jaw moved briefly. "She drove you to that class every Tuesday night for 6 weeks because you didn't have a car yet, and Dad needed the truck." "I know," I said. "And it's in Amber's centerpiece." "In the photograph," I said. "In 9 photographs." Leonard set his mug down with a precision that made clear he was managing the force behind it. Colette laid her hand over his on the table, not to restrain him from anything, but because that is what you do when the person next to you is carrying something you have no way to carry for them. We were still at the kitchen table at noon when the doorbell rang. I knew before I got up. I can't fully explain how. Perhaps it was something in the quality of the ring itself, that particular 2-note press, held with the deliberate patience of someone who has rehearsed their arrival rather than simply arriving. Or perhaps it was that Derek knew Leonard was here, because Cliff Branagh's driveway was visible from the street, and a gray Volvo with Savannah plates was not an ordinary Saturday morning sight on Sycamore Street. Derek stood on my front porch with a brown paper bag from Trader Joe's, and the expression of a man who had concluded that showing up with food was the same as showing up with goodwill. Amber was beside him in a burgundy wool coat, hair down, wearing the version of herself she brought out when she needed to seem approachable rather than polished. She was carrying a small wrapped package with a ribbon on it. A ribbon. "Hey, Dad," Derek said. His voice had that manufactured warmth of someone who has practiced it, warm in the way a room is warm when the heat has just been switched on. "We wanted to come by. We brought a few things." He held up the Trader Joe's bag. "Thought we could sit down and talk." I stepped back from the door. They came into the entry hall and saw Leonard at the kitchen table. Something crossed Derek's face, fast, involuntary there, and gone in under a second. Not guilt. Recalculation. The look of a man who has walked into a room expecting a specific layout and found the pieces rearranged. "Uncle Leonard," he said. The warmth adjusted instantly, widening to absorb the new variable. "I didn't realize you were coming up." "I know you didn't," Leonard said. He didn't stand. He didn't reach out his hand. He picked up his coffee mug and held it and looked at his nephew with the level stillness he had been maintaining since I told him about the phone call 4 years ago. The call Derek had placed from my number in my voice to dismantle the one brotherly relationship I had left after Patricia died. Derek set the Trader Joe's bag on the counter. Amber placed the wrapped package on the entry table with the careful positioning of someone who wanted it seen without wanting to be observed positioning it. "We owe you an apology," Derek said to me. He said it cleanly, no preamble, which I recognized at once as the opening line of a prepared statement. That Wednesday was mishandled. The communication about the change of plans wasn't what it should have been. Amber and I have gone over it, and we get why you feel the way you do. "Do you?" I said. "We do." He dipped his head with the sincerity of someone who had been advised that dipping your head looked sincere. "We're here to make it right." Amber pulled the ribbon free from the package she'd set on the entry table and extended it toward me. A picture frame. New high-end, the kind you find on a shelf at Home Goods, sold 3 to a box. Inside sat a photograph I had never laid eyes on. Derek and me at a backyard barbecue, give or take 6 years back, both of us looking at something off to one side, both of us mid-laugh. It was a good photograph. I knew exactly which afternoon it came from, but nobody had ever told me it existed. "We figured," Amber said, measuring each word, "that this was something you'd want to have." I studied the photograph. I studied my son's face in it, open, nothing held back, genuinely caught in laughter at something I'd said from a time before the gap between us had set into the shape it now held. "When did you decide to come?" I asked. Derek blinked. "This morning." We wanted to Gareth Finch's office sent you formal written notice yesterday afternoon. I said confirming the property transfer had been permanently cancelled and that no future conveyance of the Claremont Court property to Derek Raymond Voss or Amber Kinnaird Voss would move forward without a new written directive from me. I held his gaze. What time did that notice land in your inbox? The warmth Derek was wearing didn't leave his face. It shifted, settled into something flatter and more deliberate beneath its surface. Dad. What time, Derek? A pause. Amber's hand located the edge of the counter behind her. 3:47. Derek said it quietly. And when did you make the decision to come here today? The kitchen held its silence. Colette's hands folded in her lap. Leonard hadn't so much as shifted. Derek's jaw went tight. For just a moment, the manufactured warmth dropped away, and what sat underneath it was exposed something unfinished. Not sorrow, not any real remorse. The raw, particular irritation of a man who had engineered a careful play and watched it named before he could run it. We came to fix things, he said. The warmth had left the room now entirely. The voice that replaced it was something closer to the one he was actually born with. Regardless of what you think about when we showed up. I think the when I said tells me exactly what I need to know about the why. I lifted the frame from where Amber had set it and studied the photo one more time. My son laughing at a backyard barbecue 6 years ago. An honest photograph. The moment it caught was genuine, which was precisely what made it the most wrong thing they could have walked in with. Keep it, I said. I placed it back on the entry table. That's a real photograph. It belongs with you. The frame rested on the entry table between us like a ruling no one had yet announced. Derek looked at it. Then he looked at me. Something stirred behind his eyes that hadn't been there for years. Not the performed warmth, not the controlled recalibration. Something rawer than that. Something that had been sitting beneath all of it, the face of a man who has burned through every prepared version of himself and is standing in front of his father with no buffer left between them and the real space. You're really going to do this, he said. It's already done, I said. The house. His voice rose a degree. You're pulling it back over a dinner, one dinner, Dad. Over 4 years, I said. The dinner was the final entry in a long list. The dinner wasn't the list. Amber drifted away from the counter toward the entry hall in that quiet way she had of changing position, without appearing to retreat, locating better ground from which to manage what was developing. Leonard and Colette had stayed exactly where they were at the kitchen table. I was aware of them the way you're aware of structural support. You don't need to look at it to know it's holding the weight. We had plans in motion, Derek said. There's a contractor already booked. Amber has been deep in conversation with a designer. We've been telling people for months this was a done deal. You told people, I said, before a single document had my signature on it. You were briefing your coworkers 3 weeks ago. You described this to Amber's family as a tax move on my end. You stood in front of 12 people at a Thanksgiving table I wasn't invited to and talked about working toward that house. And you never said my name once. My voice stayed flat. You erected plans on a foundation with no legal existence. Now that the foundation is gone, you want to frame that as me taking something away. You promised us. I told you what I was considering doing, I said. An intention is not a deed. Call Gareth Finch, he'll walk you through the distinction at whatever length you need. Derek's hands moved to his hips, a posture I knew from when he was 15 and had run out of words, the stance of someone who has exhausted every verbal option and is reaching for his body's architecture to manufacture an authority he no longer commands. You want to know what your actual problem is. A different register, now unvarnished, stripped of all that rehearsed warmth. What was coming up now was whatever had always been sitting beneath the presentation. When everything you've ever given us has had strings on it. Not one thing came clean. The minute we step 1 inch out of line, out comes the hand, and back goes the gift. I looked at my son. I had seen this argument coming the way you read an approaching front on the horizon. Not the exact minute, but the shape of it, the pressure behind it, the particular weight in the air that signals what's moving your way. I had fielded versions of it before in smaller rooms about smaller stakes. What he was delivering now was the completed construction built up over years, brick by brick, from every no I had ever said. Every yes I had qualified with something he found inconvenient. Then let me be specific, I said, about what I have actually given you. Not for acknowledgement. So you can see what the string you're describing actually looked like. His mouth started to open. I kept talking. In 2008, I put $17,000 toward your outstanding college loans because you phoned me from your apartment the week after graduation and said you couldn't simultaneously cover the rent and the minimum payment. Every time I explained that money to you, to your mother, to myself, I called it a gift. I stopped. In 2013, when you and Amber were trying to get into the Avondale Terrace house, you came up $200 short of what the lender would accept for the down payment. I moved that amount out of my own savings on a Tuesday morning and told Cliff Branagh I was just helping you get a foothold. Derek's jaw tightened and held. In 2016, you rang me because Amber's car needed a transmission and the shop was quoting $300, and your next bonus hadn't come in yet. I got in my truck, drove to the mechanic in Marietta, settled the bill at the desk, and drove back. Christmas that year, I said nothing about it. No subsequent dinner, no passing remark. Never entered it into any kind of accounting. I kept my eyes on him. In 2018, your car loan had lapsed 4 months behind, and the lender had already opened default proceedings. I cleared the balance, $8,600, and asked you to set up automatic payments so it wouldn't happen again. You agreed. It didn't happen. Amber had stopped moving near the entry hall. She had gone entirely still. And since 2010, I have carried your line on my cell plan because you asked me to add you that spring when you were between jobs, and you never mentioned dropping off, and it never felt like the kind of thing a father brings up. I kept my delivery even, and without heat, the way I work through load calculations on a job, not emotionally, because emotion is where the errors creep in, but precisely because precision is the one language nobody can successfully dispute. Every appliance that quit on you, every fixture, every piece of work in that house. I showed up, and I handled it, and I charged you nothing, because you called, and because you were my son, and because showing up to repair things was the clearest form I had of telling you that. I paused. For 11 days in 2020, I looked after your dog while you and Amber were in Cancun. You didn't check with me about my schedule first. You handed me the drop-off time. The kitchen was completely still. Colette had lifted her mug toward her mouth and stopped there suspended. I am not laying all of this out, I said, because I'm looking for gratitude. I'm laying it out because you just stood in this kitchen and called every one of those things a string, and I need you to understand how a string actually works. It has 2 ends, and one of those ends belongs to the one doing the giving. The other end belongs to the person who keeps pulling without ever looking at what they are pulling from. Derek's face had cycled through several expressions in quick succession and landed on something I hadn't seen there since he was very small. A kind of stripped-down bewilderment, the look of someone who has held a particular story about themselves for so long that being offered a different account of the same events doesn't produce anger so much as a specific vertigo. That is not, he started. Derek! Leonard's voice came from the kitchen doorway. He had gotten to his feet. He wasn't raising it. He didn't need to. Let him finish. Derek turned toward his uncle. Whatever he read in Leonard's face, the 4 years of silence, the call placed from a number that wasn't his, the letters sent to a door they never reached, closed his mouth without a word. I waited until I was certain he'd stay quiet. "I loved your mother for 31 years, I said. "I worked for 39, and then I saved for 4 more on top of that. None of that was done to store up leverage over you. I did it because that was the form my love took, practical, concrete, present whenever something needed to be fixed. My voice held, though it cost me. But love and entitlement are not the same thing, and giving freely does not transfer ownership." Amber spoke up for the first time since the entry hall. "Harold," she said. Her voice was unlike any version of it I had heard from her before. Quieter, less composed, the voice of someone who has just grasped that the room they've been performing in has emptied of its audience. "We didn't look at it that way. I know," I said. That was the most honest thing I said in the whole of that conversation. I believed her. Not that she bore no responsibility, she did. But what she and Derek had done was not malice in its clearest sense. It was the failure that belongs to people who have been receiving things for so long that the hands doing the giving have gone invisible to them. They had stopped seeing me. What they saw was what I supplied. Those two things had blurred together so slowly that by the time I was standing in a grocery store on Thanksgiving morning, my absence from their table had registered to them as a reasonable arrangement rather than something cut away. Derek cleared his throat and lowered himself onto the bottom step of my entry hall staircase. Elbows on his knees, face in his hands, he stayed there. I didn't cross the room toward him. I didn't offer anything. I held my ground and let the room be what it had become, a place where the truth had been spoken at full volume for the first time in longer than either of us could accurately measure, and where no one was obligated to make it easier before it had finished doing what truth does when you stop dragging furniture in front of it. Derek and Amber left at 2:15. The Trader Joe's bag stayed behind. Whether they meant to leave it, or whether they simply walked out in the particular fog that settles after a conversation that went nothing like you planned, I couldn't say. Either way, it sat on my kitchen counter through the rest of the afternoon. Artisan crackers, a wedge of smoked Gouda, a jar of pepper jelly from Trader Joe's, the precise items a person selects when they want to project thoughtfulness without putting too much thought into who they're actually buying for. I put the Gouda in the refrigerator and left the rest where it was, because throwing it out felt wasteful, and eating it felt like a decision I wasn't ready to make. Leonard and Colette stayed another hour. We didn't revisit Derek. Everything that needed saying had been said with him in the room, and going back over it in his absence would have turned grief into something closer to gossip. A line Patricia had drawn early in our marriage, one I had tried to hold ever since. So Leonard told me about a restaurant in Savannah he and Colette had been going to on Friday evenings for 3 years. Colette talked about a garden she'd put in at the back of their place. I told them about the fig tree Patricia had planted in 2002 that had never produced a single ripe fig. And for 45 minutes the three of us sat in a kitchen, talking about ordinary things, which turned out to be a kind of repair in itself. When they headed out, Leonard gripped me by both shoulders in the doorway, the way our father used to, studying my face, the way you study something you've been away from long enough that you need to relearn it. "Saturday after next," he said, "come to Savannah. Stay the weekend." "I'll be there," I said. I meant it without reservation, which was a different quality of meaning than I had managed for most things in the previous 48 hours. I called Adaeze Nwosu at 3:30. Her name had come from Gareth Finch, who had passed it along at the close of our Friday afternoon call with the particular weight of a man who does not hand out recommendations without reason. He'd told me Adaeze ran the Decatur office of a nonprofit called Cornerstone Housing Partners, that she had been working in transitional housing placement for 14 years, and that if I was serious about what I'd described, she was the right first conversation to have. Not because she would tell me what I wanted to hear, but because she would tell me what I needed to know, which was a different and considerably more valuable thing. She picked up on the third ring with the clipped competence of someone for whom Saturday afternoons were working hours by choice rather than circumstance. "Mr. Voss," she said after I'd given my name and mentioned Gareth. He called ahead. "I've been expecting to hear from you." "I appreciate you picking up on a weekend," I said. "Transitional housing doesn't keep weekend hours," she said. Not with bitterness, practically the way an electrician might observe that power failures don't respect holidays. "Tell me about the property," I told her. Single-story bungalow on Claremont Court in Decatur. 3 bedrooms, covered back porch, purchased outright with no mortgage, title entirely in my name, structurally sound, with some cosmetic updating still to do. Roughly 1,800 square feet level lot near a bus line within the school boundary for 2 elementary schools. Adaise asked questions the way a good diagnostician does not, to confirm what she'd already concluded, but to surface what she hadn't yet learned. She asked about the roof's age, the HVAC, whether the electrical panel had been brought up to date, whether any permits were still open on the property. She asked what timeline I had in mind, and what role I expected to play once a placement was made. I answered her straight. The roof was 11 years old, with a remaining useful life somewhere in the range of 8 to 12 years depending on conditions. The HVAC had been serviced 6 months before purchase and was running correctly. The electrical panel was 100 amp service, which I planned to upgrade to 200 amp myself before any family moved in, because 200 amp was the appropriate standard for a functioning household, and I wasn't going to put anyone into a house running short on capacity. No open permits. My timeline was open. My intention was not. The electrical upgrade, Adaise said. "You handle that personally." "I'm a licensed electrician," I said. 39 years. I've kept my Georgia license current because I wasn't ready to stop being useful in that particular way. A brief pause. "Most donors," she said, "write a check, Mr. Voss." "I know," I said. "I've written checks. They don't feel like much." A longer pause. I could hear her moving, the sound of a chair, the shift of papers being rearranged. "Cornerstone operates what we call bridge placements," she said. "A family arrives through us from temporary shelter or an emergency housing situation. Both adults or one are working or actively pursuing work. But they're caught no savings cushion, no rental record, no deposit funds short of everything the private market requires before it will hand over a lease. We place them in a stable property for 9 to 12 months. In that time, they work alongside a case manager, they rebuild savings, they build the rental history they need to qualify for permanent housing on their own terms. The owner keeps the title," I said. It wasn't a question. Gareth had walked me through the structure on Friday. I wanted to hear her lace it out herself. "The owner retains title throughout. Adaise confirmed. What we execute is a long-term use agreement, a formal contract between Cornerstone and the property owner, setting out the terms of our use of the property, our obligations around maintenance and tenant management, and the conditions under which the agreement can be adjusted or ended. You'd receive regular condition reports on the property. You would not collect rent. The placement is funded through our program. But full legal ownership would remain yours, along with all the associated tax position." "What becomes of the family at the 12-month mark?" I asked. "The goal," she said, "is that they move into permanent housing they've qualified for on their own. That's what we're building toward. Our placement success rate for families who complete the full program is 73%, achieving independent permanent housing within 6 months of program completion." A pause. "The other 27% require additional support. We do not abandon them. We adjust." I was at the kitchen window while she spoke, looking out at the fig tree. The afternoon sun was hitting it at an angle that made it appear briefly almost fruitful. Patricia would have caught that immediately. She'd have said the tree had finally found its purpose not in bearing fruit, but in catching light on a November afternoon, which she'd have pointed out was a more honest achievement than most things could claim. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I want you to answer it the way you would answer a question from a colleague, not from a donor." "All right," Daisy said. "Is there a risk that doing this using a property this way is something I'm considering because I'm angry at specific people, and this feels like the opposite of what they wanted?" What followed wasn't a conversational pause. It was the kind that belongs to someone actually weighing a question before responding. "Yes," she said. "That risk exists. It exists for every donor who comes to us following a family conflict, a divorce, a death, a falling out of some kind. Reactive generosity is generosity. It still houses families, but it does not always survive the anger cooling." She let that sit. "What I ask in those situations is whether the decision still holds once the anger has burned off, not in place of the anger. After it." I thought about Vivian Holt's handshake, the grip of someone who had built something real. I thought about Eli's sneaker, the sole pulling away from the upper. I thought about the question he had put to me in that measured, careful voice, the voice of a child who had been taught not to take things for granted. "Is it really real?" "It makes sense after," I said. "Then let's schedule a site visit," Daisy said. "I'd like to see them property before we go further. Are you available Tuesday morning?" "I'll make myself available," I said. I noted the time on the same pad Patricia had used for grocery lists. Same block lettering I'd been printing for 11 years of my own, on the page that fell directly after the one I'd taken into Kroger on Peachtree Road on Thanksgiving morning. That page still carried corn pudding mix in my handwriting, a remnant from a holiday that had arrived as something unrecognizable and left as something I wouldn't choose to erase even knowing what I know now. I pulled onto Claremont Court on Sunday, while the street was still quiet before the neighborhood shook itself awake. Deliberate. 4 decades of job sites had drilled it into me. You read a space most clearly before anyone else shows up carrying their version of what it ought to be. A room at 7:00 in the morning gives you the truth of itself, not the version you get at noon, while a contractor circles the perimeter with a legal pad and the client talks about cabinet finishes. The light reads differently that early. So do the sounds. The space is nothing but itself undisguised. I cut the engine in the drive and sat a moment without moving. The brick path to the front door was the same narrow run I'd covered 11 times since closing twice, alongside Derek and Amber twice with my agent, the remainder alone at one stage of the paperwork or another. The frost that had laced the grass during the final weeks of the transaction had since given way to the dry December cold particular to Decatur, sharp enough to fog your breath, but short of anything you'd call real hardship. That quality of winter had been one of the things Patricia loved about this corner of Georgia, and one I had quietly stopped registering until there was no one left to name it. Inside the house held the smell that empty houses always hold. Not stale, not off-putting, simply absent. The scent of human occupation cooking laundry, the slow accumulation of daily living was gone, and what remained was a kind of atmospheric zero. Morning light pushed through the bay window and laid a long bar across the hardwood floor. I stood in it a moment. The listing had described that light accurately, and I had not yet allowed myself the plain permission to occupy a room I owned with no particular purpose beyond being in it. Then I got to work. Full diagnostic kit spread out, voltage tester, multimeter, circuit tracer, outlet tester. Patricia had given me the worn leather tool roll for our 20th anniversary. I'd carried it to every job since, and would carry it until it gave out. which, judging by how things were going, figured to happen sometime after I did. The electrical panel was my starting point, housed in a utility closet just off the kitchen hallway. It was a 100-amp service exactly as I'd described to Adeazi, code-compliant for when it was installed early 1990s, with a single update in 2003 per the permit records I'd requested from the DeKalb County Department of Building and Safety before closing. In Georgia, 100 amps meets the residential minimum. But meeting the minimum and meeting the need are two different standards. A family running a washer, a dryer, a dishwasher, a refrigerator window units, and the ordinary spread of modern devices could bring a 100-amp panel to its knees without doing anything out of the ordinary. The correct answer was 200 amps. It was also work I could perform myself under proper permits. Georgia requires a permit from the local building department for residential electrical work, along with a final city inspector sign-off before anything is considered finished and legal. A licensed electrician handles their own permit, does the work, and books the inspection directly. It adds time you'd skip if you just handed a check to someone else, but the result is something you know, root to tip, because your hands put it there. 2 hours of circuit tracing. 14 circuits for the living areas, 2 dedicated lines for kitchen appliances, 1 for the laundry closet dryer connection. Copper wiring throughout which was exactly right. Aluminum branch wiring had plagued residential construction from the late 1960s into the mid-1970s, and any house carrying it needed specific remediation. Not this one. Whoever owned it before had tended the place with the unhurried thoroughness of people who grasped that a house is a system, and systems decay without care. The gaps weren't neglect, they were age. Capacity was the main issue, along with bathroom grounding upgrades, and 2 additional kitchen circuits to meet current receptacle spacing code. Notes went into a small spiral pad I kept in my chest pocket. Not Patricia's grocery notepad, a work notebook, a different thing entirely. I'd kept one since my apprentice year after a foreman explained that a tradesman who didn't document was simply a tradesman who had scheduled himself to do everything twice. Measurements, circuit numbers, load figures, material quantities, block print same as always. The numbers precise because imprecision in this trade has a way of expressing itself in the walls. By 9:15, I had a full accounting of what the house required. Standing in the kitchen, I noticed the pencil line on the wall, Derek's mark, from the second walkthrough, where he'd measured out a spot for a coffee station. He'd drawn it with the easy confidence of a man who had mentally moved in, already claiming a room he had no claim to. I'd seen him do it, and registered something, a small wrong note, a minor discord in what was otherwise a quiet afternoon, gone before I could name what it was. Now I pressed my thumb to it, same as I had once before in this kitchen after Thanksgiving, turning over the same question. How does a man come to mark a wall he doesn't own as though the act of marking makes it so? The pencil line lifted. Flat paint, nothing that held. Beneath it, the wall was untouched, exactly the shade it had been before he ever laid a hand on it. I spread my palm flat against the surface. This was what I had purchased. Not a platform for Derek's coffee setup or Amber's backsplash ideas, not the renovation they had outlined to a contractor before either of them had signed so much as a single document. I had bought it wanting to hand someone something that would last. The want hadn't shifted. Who it was for had. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Cliff. Saw your truck on Claremont Court this morning. You doing okay over there? I typed back, working. Come by if you want coffee. 14 minutes later, Cliff's car pulled into the driveway. He let himself in through the unlocked front door, the way a man does when a friendship has run long enough that an open door on a job site reads as an invitation without anyone having to say so. He found me at the kitchen table going over my circuit notes. He took in the notebook, then the panel closet standing open. then the outlet tester sitting on the counter. 200 amp upgrade, he said. Tuesday I have a site visit with the housing organization, I said. I want the assessment done before A-Days sees the panel. Cliff picked up the outlet tester and turned it over in his hands, not idly, but with the attentiveness of someone who knows exactly what a tool does and respects it for that reason. You want help pulling the permit? I looked at him. Cliff held a Georgia electrician's license. He had let it lapse 2 years back, telling himself he was finished with that kind of work. But the reference manuals were still on his shelf. I'd seen them there every time I sat in his kitchen. Spines facing out the way a man shelves books he means to come back to. You'd have to reinstate it, I said. I know, he said. I looked into it last night. A pause. Takes about 3 weeks. Fee is $80. He set the outlet tester back on the counter with the same deliberate precision Leonard had used, placing his coffee mug the day before. Considered the gesture of someone who has already made up his mind and closed the door on second guessing. I've got time, and this seems like something worth being licensed for. Something caught in my throat, the same tightening that had been ambushing me on and off since Thanksgiving. The particular response of a man who had received more genuine kindness in 4 days than he had noticed in 4 years. 3 weeks then, I said. 3 weeks, Cliff said. In the meantime, I can hand you things and hold the flashlight. I laughed. It came out unguarded and real, the way laughter surfaces when you've been hauling something heavy long enough that the reflex for it goes dormant and then fires without warning. Cliff looked quietly pleased with himself, which was exactly right. Coffee's in the thermos, I said. Cups are in my bag. Adai's Nwosu arrived at Claremont Court at 9 North Tuesday morning in a dark green Honda that had clearly covered some miles and made no effort to hide it. She was shorter than her phone voice had led me to picture, 5'4", maybe 5'5", and carried herself with the kind of efficient, contained energy that belongs to people who move through demanding days by eliminating wasted motion. A practical wool coat over a collared shirt. A leather portfolio with the worn corners of something reached for every single day. Her handshake at the front door was the same one she probably used in meeting rooms and community board sessions, and the occasional tense conversation with a property owner who'd had second thoughts since the last call. Mr. Voss, she said. Harold, I said. Come in. Cliff was already there. He'd shown up 30 minutes early with his own coffee and a legal pad for notes. He said, though I suspected it was also because he hadn't been inside a property walkthrough in 2 years and had missed it more than he'd been willing to say. Adaize acknowledged him with the brief nod of a professional long, accustomed to finding various assembled parties at site visits, someone who had stopped being surprised by the particular configurations people build around important decisions. She moved through the house the same way I had on Sunday, systematically unhurried, pausing at doorways to read the proportions of a room before stepping into it. She opened every closet. She ran her own outlet tester drawn from the portfolio along the walls. She looked at the panel, registered the 100 amp service without remarking on it, and wrote something down. She ran both bathroom taps and the shower simultaneously to check water pressure. She stepped out the back door and stood on the covered porch for a full minute, taking in the yard without speaking. I didn't narrate the house for her. I'd understood early in my working life that the most useful thing you can do while a capable person is assessing something is keep clear of them and be available when they have a question. She had 3. Was I aware the hot water heater was nearing the end of its expected service life? Yes, I'd flagged it and intended to replace it before any family moved in. Was the rear fence the property boundary, or was there additional land behind it? Property line confirmed by survey. Had I determined the scope of the electrical work Yes, and I passed her my circuit notes from Sunday. She read them with the concentrated focus of someone who didn't need anything explained to her. She looked up. You wrote these yourself. Sunday morning, I said. She looked at Cliff. And you're helping with the permit and the work. Suko? License reinstatement in 3 weeks, Cliff said. We'll pull the permit the same day. Adeze wrote something else. Then she closed the portfolio and stood in the kitchen, hands folded over it, and looked at me with the directness of a person who has completed her assessment and is ready to say what she found. So this property is appropriate for our program, she said. The location is strong bus access, school proximity, walkable to a grocery store on Peachtree Road. The structure is sound. The upgrades you've identified are the right ones. And the fact that you're doing them yourself rather than patching tells me you understand what a family actually needs in a house versus what looks good on a checklist. She paused. I want to be direct with you about what comes next. Please, I said. We will conduct our own inspection through a licensed contractor standard practice, not a reflection on your assessment. That takes approximately 2 weeks. Assuming it confirms what your notes indicate, we'll move to drafting the long-term use agreement. That document will specify that Cornerstone holds operational responsibility for the property for the duration of each placement tenant, screening case, management, maintenance, coordination, and all direct interaction with the family. She held my gaze. You will not choose the family. I want to be unambiguous about that. Our screening process evaluates every applicant household against the same criteria. Your property goes into the pool. The family that fits the criteria most closely receives the placement. That's exactly what I want, I said. She studied me for a moment. Most donors say that at the start. I mean it, I said. I met a woman and her grandson at the Decatur community table on Thanksgiving. They're the reason I started looking at this differently. But I don't know enough about their circumstances to conclude they need this more than someone I've never met. That judgment is yours to make. I'm not qualified for it. Adese's expression didn't shift dramatically. She wasn't built for dramatic expressions, but something in it settled the way a level settles when the bubble finds the center and stops moving. All right, she said. We'll proceed. She left at 10:40. Cliff and I stood on the front porch and watched the dark green Honda reverse out of the driveway with the careful competence of its driver. She's good, Cliff said. Yes, I said. My phone rang at 2:17 that afternoon. Derek's name on the screen no longer produced the complicated, bracing dread it had carried the previous 5 days. What it produced now was simpler, the flat recognition of a number I knew and a conversation I was ready to have or not have depending on what came through on the other end. I answered. Dad. His voice had changed since Saturday. The rawness that had been lurking beneath his prepared warmth was nearer the surface, now less managed, less covered over. I need to talk to you about something. Go ahead, I said. A pause. There's a payment that came through on my credit card. A balance transfer I set up through your account 18 months ago. Another pause. The automatic payment from your account didn't process this month. I had known this call was coming since Saturday afternoon, when I had logged into my online banking and methodically removed Derek's name from every linked account, automatic transfer, and authorized user arrangement I had built up across 11 years of what I had been calling help, and what I could now see had operated as an unconditional subsidy. The balance transfer had been Derek's idea. He had framed it as a sound financial move, shifting high-interest debt onto a lower-rate instrument using my credit score as the qualifying factor. I had agreed because the reasoning had seemed solid. and because I had developed the habit of agreeing to things that seemed solid when my son proposed them without ever turning that habit over to examine what was underneath it. "The automatic payment won't be processing anymore," I said. "I removed the authorization last Saturday." The silence on his end had enough length to take on a shape. "Dad, that payment is for $300 a month." "I know what it is," I said. "I've been paying it for 18 months. If it doesn't process, the account goes delinquent in 30 days. His voice climbed a register. "My credit score, Amber's credit score, both of us take the hit." "I understand how it works," I said. "Then you understand that this would—" He caught himself, tried again. "You can't just remove that without any notice." I thought about Thanksgiving morning standing in the grocery store, about a phone call that had ended my expectation of a seat at my son's table, 9 words spoken in the flat tone of a man who had already moved on from the decision. About the gap between warning and consideration, and how that gap had always run in the same direction in our relationship, and for considerably longer than 18 months. "Derek," I said, "I'm going to say one thing. After that, this is yours to handle." He was breathing in a way I could hear, waiting for it. "You have a job," I said. "Amber has a job. You have a house I helped you get into and a car I helped you keep on the road, and 11 years of financial scaffolding you have been standing on without ever looking down to see what was holding you up." My voice stayed even. "The scaffolding is coming down, not because I want to watch you struggle, because you are 38 years old and I have been conducting myself as though you couldn't stay upright on your own. I think we've both been wrong about that for a long time." A long pause. "What are we supposed to do? Not angry anymore. Something rawer than anger. Something that had lost its armor." "Call the lender," I said. "Lay out your situation. Ask about hardship programs. Most credit issuers have them, and a borrower who reaches out before a payment lapses is in a far stronger position than one who waits until the account is already in trouble." I let that sit. "You're a sales manager, Derek. Getting on the phone and working out terms is something you know how to do. Apply it." I hung up. Out past the kitchen window, the fig tree held the afternoon light, the same way it had on Sunday, hopeful, barren, entirely itself. I set the phone down on the counter and picked my circuit notes back up. The first Saturday of December, I returned to the Decatur community table. No bakery box this time. No particular agenda. Thursday evening, I'd checked the volunteer schedule. Saturdays, 9:00 to noon. I pulled onto Scott Boulevard at 8:50, took the same parking spot I'd used on Thanksgiving, and went through the front door as a man with a few free hours and a preference for putting them toward something that mattered. The coordinator gave me a form, a name tag, and gloves. Supply room. Donated winter clothing to be sorted by size. I spent 90 minutes working coats and children's snow pants into bins marked with strips of masking tape, specific enough work to keep my hands engaged, while something larger moved through the rest of me, sorting through the week I'd just crossed. I heard Eli before I spotted him. 10:30. His voice came out of the common area at the volume that belongs naturally to 8-year-olds, roughly double what any given room calls for. He was deep in an argument about how fractions had been poorly conceived from the start and what the correct design should have looked like. The argument had the particular heat of something he'd been building for a while. I came out of the supply room. Vivienne was at a corner table library book coffee, the bearing of a woman who had figured out how to go still inside whatever noise surrounded her. She looked up and placed me. Eli cut off mid-sentence on the subject of numerators. "You're the cake man," he said. "That's one way to put it," I said. "Harold." I told them both. Eli turned the first name over in his mind, the way kids do when handed something unfamiliar to examine. Then he aimed his fractions case at me on the reasonable grounds that a new listener was better than a tired one. When he went off to find a worksheet, Vivian set her book down. "I wasn't sure we'd see you again," she said. "I wasn't sure either," I said. "On Thanksgiving, there wasn't much I was certain about. Oh, how are you doing?" "Better," I said. "Clearer." She nodded slowly. Clarity tends to cost something. Eli came back and laid his worksheet out across the table with the authority of someone staking a claim. Pencil sharpened to about 3 inches, worked down with the focus of a person who declined to acknowledge it was nearly gone. Vivian caught my eye across the top of his head, the look of a grandmother who had sat through this fractions lecture 17 times. "He's been at the same school since September," she said, keeping her voice low. "Same teacher, same cubby. Before that, 4 moves in 14 months. I turned over what Adaiz had said. A stable address. Not large, not beautiful. Stable. The kind of place where a child knows exactly where their backpack will be in the morning, because it was there the night before. 31 years at Emory University Hospital, Vivian said when I asked about her life before. Pediatric ward. Retired in 2018. The building sold in 2021. New owner raised rent 60% inside a year. My savings weren't designed to absorb that. She offered it without ornamentation, without directing me toward any particular feeling about it. My daughter is working through some things. Eli is with me, or where he belongs. There's a program called Cornerstone Housing Partners, I said. They place families in stable housing, transitional 9 to 12 months while things get sorted out. I have a property currently under their evaluation. I held her gaze. I'm not saying this as a guarantee. The program decides on its own terms. I've deliberately removed myself from the selection process. But it might be worth raising with your caseworker. Her hand stopped moving around the coffee cup. You're the owner, she said. A statement, not a question. Yes. She sat with it, weighing what it meant and what it didn't, deciding whether the line I'd drawn between informing and promising was a real distinction or a courteous one. If the program chose us, she said at last, it would be because we met the criteria. Yes, I said. Exactly that. Eli glanced up from his worksheet wearing the expression of a child who has taken on an equation and come out ahead. He said, Harold, testing it again on his tongue, are fractions ever actually useful? Like in real life, I thought about load calculations, wire gauge ratios, the precise fraction of an inch that determines whether a fitting holds or weeps for 3 weeks straight. Constantly, I said. I'll show you sometime. He bent back over his paper. The current was running in the right direction. Derek picked Watershed, the coffee shop on Commerce Drive. Midpoint between our 2 houses, neutral ground, which told me something about where he thought the advantage no longer lived. He was there before me, back against the walleyes on the door. A full cup he hadn't touched, hands wrapped around it the way you hold something when what you really need is just something solid to hold. I got my order and settled into the chair across from him. The credit card lender agreed to a hardship arrangement, he said. Reduced minimum payment for 6 months. I called them like you said. Good, I said. Amber picked up a second consulting project. We're managing. He studied his cup for a moment, then looked up. I've been sitting with what you said on Saturday. About the scaffolding. I didn't recognize it as scaffolding. I knew you were helping. I didn't think about what it meant that the help was just always there. A brief tightening in his jaw. I'm not offering that as an excuse. I'm trying to be accurate about what I actually knew as opposed to what I should have known. That was the most unguarded thing he'd said to me since well before Thanksgiving. I let it register without making a show of it, because when you perform a reaction to honesty, you train the other person to treat honesty as theater. I hear you, I said. Is there a version of this where we find our way back? He asked. As a family, that depends on what finding our way back means to you, I said. If it means returning to the arrangement we had before, I'm telling you clearly that I won't do that. Not as punishment, because that arrangement was harmful to both of us, and neither one of us saw it for what it was until 10 days ago. So 40 years of being your son means nothing. One Thanksgiving, I said. And 4 years of cutting me off from my brother. 8 months of running surveys among the neighbors about whether my mind was going. 11 years of financial support you summarized to people at work, as the old man finally pulling his weight. The Thanksgiving wasn't the reason, Derek. It was the moment I finally saw the whole picture for what it was. He shifted back from the table a few inches. You're never going to forgive me, he said. I already have, I said. He sat with open confusion on his face. But forgiveness and restoration are not the same transaction, I said. I forgive you because the weight of not forgiving is more than I choose to carry. That doesn't reconstruct the scaffolding. It doesn't hand back automatic access to my time and my money and my presence as though the last 10 days were something that didn't happen. I leaned in. What it restores is the possibility of something different, something honest. Where you are mine, because you choose to show up as my son, not because I have made it financially comfortable to keep me in your life. He fixed his eyes on the table. I don't know how to do that, he said. The different version. Neither do I yet, I said. That's the point. You work it out without a blueprint. That's also what makes it real rather than just convenient. When he finally looked up, something in his face had shifted, not resolved, not healed. Shifted the way a sealed room shifts when someone cracks a window. Something had gotten in. The house on Claremont Court, he said. Is that already decided? Yes, I said. It is. One small nod. The nod of a man taking in a fact, not contesting it. We stayed another 10 minutes and talked about nothing in particular. The traffic on the 210, the cold snap, a place on Peachtree Road that had gone under new ownership. The small talk of two people willing to remain in the same space after something difficult has finished. I paid for both coffees on the way out, because some habits take longer to look at than others. Gareth Finch called on the Thursday before Christmas to tell me the long-term use agreement had been fully executed. 23 pages, both parties signed, notarized, filed. The title to Claremont Court remained entirely in my name. What I had committed was not ownership, but use. The organized, supervised, case-managed use of a house I still owned, by families chosen through a process I had deliberately excluded myself from. Gareth said to reach out if anything came up. I thanked him and ended the call before he'd finished his sentence. Then I called Cliff. He picked up on the second ring, with the alertness of a man who had kept part of himself available all morning without owning up to it. Agreements executed, I said. A brief pause. Then we're working tomorrow. We started at 7 on Friday morning. The December air had the quality Patricia used to call good working weather, cold enough to be honest. Not cold enough to make you regret being outdoors. She came back to me every time the air felt like that. I had stopped trying to head that off. Cliff was already in the driveway when I arrived. his truck loaded with conduit and wire and the 200-amp panel we'd ordered from the supply house on Memorial Drive. He was studying the roofline the way tradesmen study a structure before starting finding its internal logic, before layering their own on top of it. We didn't need much conversation to work. That was the particular pleasure of being alongside someone who knew their craft. The job became its own language. By noon, the old panel was out, and the rough work on the new service entrance was well underway. We ate sandwiches on the covered back porch. Cliff had brought them in a cooler, without a word, the way Cliff did things. The December sun reached the porch exactly as the listing had described. "So, Adaize called this morning," I said. "Inspection report came back clean. Program is moving into placement evaluation. They're screening families now." Cliff looked out at the yard. "Vivian and the boy, I don't know," I said. I asked Adaize not to share who applied or where anyone stands. If they're selected, I'll find out when the placement is announced. If they're not, someone else needed it more. That's the right outcome. "You believe that?" he asked, not skeptical. Genuine. "Yes," I said. "I believe it." Cliff folded his wax paper into a tidy square the way a man does when the motion has long since become reflex. Then he looked at me straight. "Patricia would have been proud of this," he said. "Not just the house, the whole way you handled it. She used to tell Dottie you were the most capable man she'd ever known, but that you had a blind spot about what you deserved. Said she'd spent 30 years trying to fix it, and wasn't sure she'd made a dent." My throat did the thing it had been doing since Thanksgiving. A man who has not cried in front of another person in 6 years, and is not going to start now, but whose body keeps its own separate accounting of what is worth mourning. "She would have picked the kitchen backsplash herself," I said, "and told Adaize it was just a suggestion." Cliff laughed. "And Adaize would have thanked her and done something entirely different. And Patricia would have respected that enormously," I said. We went back inside and finished the work. At 4:30 I stood in the utility closet and looked at the new 200-amp panel mounted where the old one had been. Same wall, same closet, different capacity, more room for what the house would now be asked to carry. Along Claremont Court, the streetlights came on one by one as we loaded the trucks without hurrying the unhurried rhythm of a neighborhood, announcing that the day had wound down and the people inside had switched on their lights and life was continuing in all its ordinary directions. Adaize called on the second Tuesday of January at 8:43 while I was in the middle of replacing the hot water heater at Claremont Court. I wiped my hands on my work pants and picked up. "The placement panel completed its review," she said. "The family selected for the first placement is Vivian Holt and her grandson Eli. They ranked first on every qualifying criterion. I want to be transparent. I knew you had met them. I reviewed their file against the next 3 ranked families. The gap was significant. They would have placed first, regardless of your prior contact." My knees settled onto the edge of the bathtub without asking me first. "Thank you for telling me that," I said. "Move-in is scheduled for the first Saturday of February," Adaize said. "Is the property ready?" "Hot water heater done by noon today," I said. 200-amp service certified. Cliff repaired the back gate last weekend because the hinge had loosened, and he said he wasn't going to leave it that way. A brief silence I had come to recognize as Adaize's version of warmth. "It always was in good hands," she said. "You just had the wrong people in mind for it." After the call, I sat without moving. The supply line dripped onto the utility closet floor with the patient indifference of water that follows gravity regardless of whatever else is going on around it. I thought about Vivian's hands going still around her coffee cup the moment I mentioned Cornerstone. I thought about Eli and his 3-inch pencil and the way he had tested my name like a proposition he wanted to verify. I was not angry. The anger had run its course and left behind something quieter, not peace exactly, but the particular clarity that comes to a man who has stopped arguing with what happened and turned his attention toward what he does next. I finished the hot water heater and returned to work. Move-in day was the first Saturday of February, and I spent it at Cliff's kitchen table with a cup of coffee, not driving to Claremont Court. That took more deliberate restraint than I had anticipated. I knew the move-in was set for 10:00 in the morning. I knew Adaizi's case manager would be on site. I knew the program supplied a basic household kit: bedding, towels, kitchen essentials, because Adaizi had described it on our second call. I knew everything I needed to know, and none of it required me to be there for it to be true. At 10:17 my phone buzzed. A text from Adaizi. Family is in. Everything went smoothly. She wanted me to tell you the lights in the tree were the first thing her grandson noticed when they pulled up. I read that twice. Then I set the phone face up on Cliff's kitchen table and looked at it. Cliff refilled my coffee without asking. He'd read the message from where he was standing. He didn't say anything. That was exactly right. I thought it about Eli noticing those lights. An 8-year-old in the back seat of a car on a February morning pulling up to a house that was about to become his house for the next year, and the first thing his eyes went to was a string of lights in a liquid amber tree hung on a January evening by 2 old electricians who agreed that a yard ought to signal that a house is ready to receive someone. He had no idea who put them there. He had simply looked up and seen them. That was enough. Thanksgiving came around again, the way it always does, without checking whether you were prepared. I was prepared. The dinner was at Cliff's house because Cliff's dining room seated 8 without crowding, and we were 7. Cliff Leonard and Colette Adaz, Vivian, Eli, and me. Nobody had assigned seats. Nobody had run the menu through a single person who then spent 3 days coordinating everyone else's contributions. Leonard brought tamales because Colette's family had made them every Thanksgiving for 40 years, and she saw no reason to change that. Adaiz brought green bean casserole. Vivienne brought a pie. I came through the door carrying a chocolate cake from the bakery on Peachtree Road. Eli spotted it the moment I stepped inside, and his face did the thing it had done at the Decatur community table 13 months before. Not greed, not a performance, that particular unguarded recognition of something arriving without a condition attached. He didn't ask whether it was really for everyone this time. He already knew. After dinner, before anyone touched the cake, Eli crossed the room to where I was sitting and pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand without a word. He had written on it in the careful, oversized print of a child who understood the task was worth taking seriously. Thank you for believing I deserve a future. Your friend Eli. I held that piece of paper for a long time. A year ago, I had stood in a grocery store with a cake for a table that had decided things were simpler without me. Tonight, someone had set a place for me before I walked in the door. Not because I had arranged anything. That note from Eli, 8 words in a child's careful handwriting, was not something I had planned for. Neither was any of it really. Not the grief of that first Thanksgiving morning, not the house on Claremont Court, and not the family that turned out to be waiting on the other side of all of it. I believe God does not waste the hard years. What I lost when Patricia died, what I nearly lost when Derek and Amber made their plans without me, none of it disappeared quietly. It cost me sleep, and it cost me certainty, and it cost me the version of the future I had been building toward. But it also cleared the ground. And sometimes the ground has to be cleared before something real can take root. If this story taught me anything worth passing on, it would be this. When someone shows you that your presence is inconvenient to them, believe what they're showing you and act accordingly. Financial support given without honest accounting is not generosity. It is a slow trade you don't realize you've made until the ledger comes due. Family justice does not always look like a courtroom. Sometimes it looks like a redirected deed, and a child who finally has a stable address. And if you have ever felt erased by the people who were supposed to love you, hold on. What feels like an ending may be the beginning of something you never thought to ask for. If these dad's revenge stories speak to something you've lived through, I hope you'll share this one with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave me a comment below. I read them, and your words genuinely matter to me. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to Wise Revenge so you never miss the next story we tell together. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.